The stagecoach came in on a wind that smelled of rain, and Silas Crane stood on the platform at Dovetail, Wyoming territory, expecting one woman and getting four. He was 43 years old, a rancher with dust worked so deep into the creases of his hands that no washing had touched it in 20 years. He had written to the matrimonial agency in Cheyenne exactly once, and only because the winters on his place had grown too long and too silent to bear alone. He had asked for a woman who could keep a house and did not mind quiet. He had not asked for this. The door of the coach swung open. A boy climbed down first, maybe 9, holding his hat against the wind. Then a little girl, 6 or so, with her thumb tucked in her mouth. Then a woman stepped into the gray light with a sleeping child of perhaps 3, balanced on her hip, and a carpetbag in her free hand, held together with a length of twine. She was 31, though the road had aged her past that. Her name was Adeline Foss, and she looked at Silas Crane with the steady, braced expression of a person who had already been turned away from a great many doors. "Mr. Crane?" she said. He could not find his voice for a moment. When it came wrong. "I never sent for a widow with 3 hungry children," he said. The words hung in the cold air between them, and he would remember the shape of them for the rest of his life. He would remember, too, the way the boy's chin lifted, and the way the little girl pressed closer to her mother's skirts, and the way something in Adeline's face closed like a shutter against a storm. She did not argue. That was the thing that undid him later, when he was alone. She did not plead her case or explain herself. She simply nodded once, as though he had confirmed a thing she had always known to be true, and she turned back toward the coach and reached for the bag she had only just set down. "Come along, Tobias," she said quietly to the boy. "Winnie, we'll not stay where we're not wanted." And that should have been the end of it. She should have climbed back into that coach and ridden out of his life, and Silas Crane should have gone home to his quiet house and his long winters and never thought of her again. But something happened in the space between her hand reaching for the door and her foot reaching the step. His hand got there first. He did not decide to do it. His arm moved on its own, flat against the coach door, holding it shut, and he stood there, with his heart going like a hammer, and no earthly idea what he meant to say. "Wait," was all that came out. What Adeline Foss did not know, standing there in the wind with her sleeping daughter heavy on her hip, was that the man before her had buried more silence than most men ever carried. And what Silas did not yet know was that this woman would teach him the difference between a house and a home before the first snow ever fell. The agency had made an error. He learned that later, from the letter folded in the pocket of the stage driver's coat. The woman he had written for, a Miss Hartley of Cheyenne, had changed her mind and married a blacksmith 3 weeks prior. Rather than lose the fee, some clerk with a ledger and no heart had matched his name to the next name on the list. And the next name had been Adeline Foss, widowed that spring, put out of her rented rooms in June, with 3 children and nowhere in the world to set them down. Silas read the letter twice by the light of his kitchen lamp that night, while the children slept in his bed, and Adeline sat straight-backed in his one good chair, refusing to be comfortable. "I'll not hold you to a mistake," he told her. "You may stay the winter. There's the loft and the stove, and the children will not go hungry under my roof. Come spring, if you wish to go, I'll pay your passage anywhere you name." She studied him a long moment. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing you'd not offer freely," he said. "I've had enough of things given grudgingly to last me a life." It was not a warm beginning, but it was an honest one, and honesty, Adeline would come to learn, was the whole of the man. The first weeks were careful. They moved around each other, like 2 people sharing a narrow bridge. Silas rose before light to see to the cattle, and by the time he came in stamping snow from his boots, there was coffee on the stove, and the smell of bread in the air, and 3 small faces that went quiet whenever he entered, watching to see what kind of man he would be today. He did not know how to be around children. He had never learned. So he did the only thing he knew, which was work, and he let the children watch him do it. Little Winnie was the first to break. She was 6, and she followed him to the barn one gray morning without a word, and she stood at the stall rail, watching him fork hay to the mare until he could bear the silence no longer. "You want to feed her?" he asked. She nodded, solemn as a judge. He lifted her to the rail and put a handful of grain in her small palms, and the mare's soft lips brushed her fingers, and Winnie laughed, a sudden, bright, startled sound that seemed to surprise even her. Silas felt something shift in his chest that had been locked so long he'd forgotten it could move. By the time the boy, Tobias, worked up the nerve to speak to him plainly, the snow lay deep against the north wall of the barn. What Tobias asked him would stay with Silas the rest of his days. "Are you going to send us away in the spring?" the boy said. He was 9, and he asked it the way a boy asks a thing he has decided to be brave about. "Because if you are, I'd rather know now, so I don't get used to it." Silas set down the harness he was mending. He looked at this boy, who had learned too young to brace himself against hope, and he thought of his own father, and of all the ways a heart could be taught to expect the worst. "No," he said, "I'm not going to send you away." He had not known he meant it until he said it, but he did mean it, all the way down. Something eased in the house after that. It was a small thing, and slow, the way thaw is slow, but it was real. The children stopped going quiet when he entered a room. Winnie began leaving him small offerings on the windowsill, a smooth stone, a blue jay's feather, a button she'd found in the yard, as though paying a rent she was too young to name. Silas kept every one of them in a tin on the shelf above the stove, and told no one, and if Adeline noticed, she was kind enough not to say. The first true blizzard of the season shut them in for 4 days, and it was in those 4 snowbound days that Silas Crane understood, fully, what had come to live under his roof. They played cards by lamplight. Adeline taught the children a game her own mother had taught her, and she taught it to Silas too, patient with his fumbling, laughing when he lost, and her laugh was a thing he found himself working to earn. Pearl fell asleep against his arm on the second evening, boneless and trusting in the way only small children can be, and Silas sat unmoving for an hour, rather than wake her, his coffee going cold at his elbow, a look on his face that Adeline watched from across the room and did not remark upon. What Silas Crane was learning, in those long white days, was that a house holds out the cold, but it takes people to hold in the warmth, and he had lived a long time in a house. On the 3rd night, when the children were bedded down, Adeline found him at the window watching the snow come sideways past the glass. "You've gone quiet again," she said. "Quieter than usual, and that's a distance." "I was thinking," he said, "that I've had this same view out this same window for 20 years, and I never once, before this winter, minded being snowed in." Adeline came and stood beside him. She did not touch him, but she stood close, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, and the two of them watched the storm together, in a silence that was, for the first time in his life, not lonely. "You're a good man, Silas Crane," she said at last. "I don't think you've been told that near enough." He had not, and he could not answer her. But he stood at that window a long time after she'd gone up to bed, and he did not feel, for once, like a man watching the world from the outside of it. Word travels in a small territory, and it was not long before Dovetail knew that Silas Crane had a widow and 3 children out on his place, and no marriage lines to account for them. The talk gathered like weather, and at the center of it stood Prudence Hale, who kept the general store and considered the moral bookkeeping of the town her personal charge. Prudence Hale was 58, sharp-eyed and iron-certain, and she had decided a great many things about Adeline Foss before she had ever spoken a word to her. When Adeline came into the store for flour and thread, Prudence let her stand at the counter a long moment before she deigned to serve her, and she wrapped the goods with a tightness that said everything her mouth withheld. "Folks are talking," Prudence said at last. "A woman alone, living with a man not her husband. It's not decent." Adeline set her coins on the counter, one by one. My children are fed and warm and safe, for the first time since their father passed, she said, without heat. You may call that whatever you like, Mrs. Hale. I've stopped being ashamed of surviving. She gathered her parcel and walked out with her head level, and Prudence Hale watched her go and found, to her own irritation, that she had no answer ready. What Prudence Hale did not know was that within the month she would owe that same woman a debt she could never fully repay. It came with the fever. Prudence's grandson, a boy of 7, who lived with her since his own mother's passing, took ill, sudden and hard, the way children do in that country, in the dead of winter. The doctor was 3 days' ride, in the wrong weather, and it was Adeline Foss, who had nursed her own husband through his last illness, and knew the signs, and knew the mercies, who came through the snow when she heard, and sat up 3 nights running with a stranger's child, sponging his brow, and singing low, until the fever broke at last, near dawn, on the 4th day. Prudence Hale stood in the doorway of that sick room, and watched a woman she had shamed hold her grandson's life gently in 2 tired hands, and something in the older woman, that had been iron for a very long time, cracked clean through. "Why?" she asked, when the boy was sleeping easy at last. "After what I said to you, why did you come?" Adeline wrung out the cloth one final time and laid it aside. "Because he's a child," she said simply, "and because I know what it is to sit alone with a fever and no one coming. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, Mrs. Hale, and you were never that. You were only frightened of a thing you didn't understand." Prudence Hale did not weep in front of people, but she came close that morning, and in the years after, she would tell anyone who spoke ill of Adeline Foss that they had best mind their tongue in her store, for she'd not hear a word against the finest woman in the territory. Grace, it turned out, could turn iron softer than any shame ever could. The spring came, as it always does. The snow drew back off the hills, and the creek ran high and brown, and the day arrived that Silas had spoken of in the beginning, the day Adeline was free to name any place in the world and be carried there at his expense. He found her at the fence line one evening, watching Tobias teach little Pearl to walk the top rail, with her arms out like a bird. The boy was steadier now. The girl laughed without startling herself, and Winnie had taken to calling the mare her own. "It's spring," Silas said. "It is," said Adeline. "I told you I'd pay your passage anywhere you named." He turned his hat in his hands, the way he had that first night. "So I'm asking, where do you want to go?" Adeline was quiet a long while, watching her children in the gold light. "Nowhere," she said at last, "unless you're asking me to." And Silas Crane, 43 years old, and no good with words that mattered, found the only ones he needed. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not for the winter, for good. I sent to Cheyenne for a woman to keep my house, and God saw fit to send me a family instead. I'd be a fool to correct him." Adeline Foss looked at the man who had said, on a cold platform in the autumn, that he had never sent for her, and who had put his hand against the coach door anyway, before she could leave. She thought of all the doors that had shut against her in her life, and of the one man who had held one open when he had every right to let it close. "Then I'll stay," she said. They were married that June by the traveling preacher, under the cottonwood by the creek, with Tobias standing up beside Silas, and Winnie scattering the last of the season's wildflowers, and Pearl asleep, as always, on somebody's shoulder. Prudence Hale baked the cake herself and would not hear of being thanked for it. And if you had asked Silas Crane, in the years that followed, what had changed his life, he would not have told you it was the letter from Cheyenne, or the error of some clerk with a ledger. He would have told you it was a single moment on a windy platform, the moment his hand reached the door before hers did, the moment he chose, without knowing why, to keep open the one thing his whole life had taught him to let close. He had said he never sent for a widow with 3 hungry children. But the truth, which he came to understand slowly and then completely, was that he had been sending out for them his whole life long, in every silence he could not name, and they had come to him at last, down a muddy road in the back of a stagecoach, and he had very nearly let them go. He never did stop being grateful that he hadn't.